Hello, and welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Elliot Waldman. Just a quick note before we get started that if you like what you hear on Trendlines, you can stay up to date with new episodes by hitting the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts, and you can also find a full archive of previous episodes at worldpoliticsreview.com/podcast. October 1st marks the beginning of a new fiscal year here in the United States, and President Donald Trump started it off by telling Congress that he plans to further slash the limit for refugee admissions, which was already historically low. The administration said it would allow only 15,000 slots for refugees during fiscal year 2021, down from 18,000. The new number is less than 1/7 of the 110,000 slots that former President Barack Obama approved in 2016. As the New York Times noted, Trump's limits have virtually sealed off a pathway for the persecuted into the country and obliterated the once robust American reputation as a sanctuary for the oppressed. This comes as the number of refugees worldwide continues to grow. According to the United Nations, there are currently around 80 million forcibly displaced people around the world, including 26 million refugees and more than 4 million asylum seekers. Trump's opponent in next month's presidential election, former Vice President Joe Biden, has said he will raise the cap on refugees to 125,000. But should he win, he will have his work cut out for him in repairing other aspects of the U.S. refugee program. Joining me now to discuss this very important issue is Meredith Owen, the Interim Director of Policy and Advocacy in the Immigration and Refugee Program at Church World Service, which is one of the 9 refugee resettlement agencies in the country. Meredith, welcome to Trendlines.
Thank you for having me.
I wanted to start by asking you to give us a sense of the historical significance, not just of this new limit that the Trump administration says it will impose for the current fiscal year, but also the Trump administration's refugee policy in general. How much of an anomaly does this represent?
The Trump administration has cut the refugee resettlement program by more than 80% since Trump's inauguration in January of 2017. That's certainly something to condemn and decry as we face the worst displacement crisis in world history. But even beyond that, President Trump clearly established his administration's anti-refugee, anti-family, anti-immigrant agenda shortly after his inauguration through a series of executive orders that banned refugees and other immigrants, particularly from Muslim-majority countries, and suspended the resettlement program for months at a time. And after a series of programmatic changes that have dismantled the resettlement program in the United States, we have seen how these initial executive orders and the initial refugee and Muslim ban from January 2017 continues to separate families and harm refugees today.
Maybe you could give us some concrete examples of stories where people have suffered consequences like what you were just alluding to. How exactly do these policies have negative impacts on the lives of actual asylum seekers and refugees?
Well, we have stories of individuals like Afkab, who was resettled in Ohio toward the end of 2016. His wife and newborn son, who he had never met, were supposed to arrive in early 2017. But because of that initial executive order and refugee ban, they have faced prolonged family separation and have been unable to reunify. We've also seen how other refugee moms have been able to be resettled with 1 or 2 of their children, and they had been waiting for their other couple children to be resettled in the United States. And 3 years later, they remain separated. And this is a trend that happens because refugees are the most vetted traveler to the United States, and they undergo security vetting across a number of intelligence agencies: Department of Defense, Department of State, DHS, National Counterterrorism Center, the FBI. And these security checks have very short validity periods, and there are so many that are overlapping. So there's only ever about a 2-month window when an individual refugee is able to have everything valid and travel to the United States. And as soon as one of those checks expires because of a refugee ban or anything else, it throws all of their validity loops out of whack. And as a result, they basically have to start over in many instances through the security vetting process, which is why families like Ofcob's have been unable to reunify, because they have to go through all of these security checks all over again. And we have not seen a commitment from this administration to really double down and invest in redoing their security checks.
So they have to start all over in a process that can take up to 2 years, right?
Exactly. And at this point, we are seeing security checks take multiple years as this administration has significantly slowed down the security vetting process and has operated with a lot more opacity without giving us a window into exactly whether it's the staffing changes that have slowed the processing of cases or whatever else. We know that so many of these cases, especially from Muslim majority countries, the processing has by and large ground to a halt.
Now, is this something that is compatible with current U.S. law and also international law in terms of the legal obligations that the U.S. has undertaken?
It's definitely true that the Trump administration is violating both our legal and our moral obligations in assisting and welcoming the most vulnerable. U.S. law, through the Refugee Act of 1980, requires the administration to consult with Congress and sign a refugee admissions goal ahead of the start of a new fiscal year. And this year and last year, the Trump administration completely failed to conduct those consultations and set an admissions goal by the start of a fiscal year. That in and of itself is certainly a violation of U.S. law. But even beyond that, the U.S. resettlement program is a humanitarian tool, but it's also a really important foreign policy and diplomacy tool. It helps stabilize regions and helps us further our own national security. For example, a number of Iraqi and Afghan nationals have assisted the U.S. mission overseas, and we have specific pathways for Iraqis who have assisted the U.S. mission to be able to be resettled in the United States because they're being persecuted as a result of assisting the U.S. government. And this is a population that is incredibly important to the U.S. government's success overseas. And without our commitment to helping to welcome the individuals who have helped us and failing to uphold those obligations, we're jeopardizing our own national security in the process.
I remember when I was living in the Washington, D.C. area, I had a Lyft driver who was from Afghanistan and who had served as a translator for the United States. And he told me that he had fallen in love, gotten married, had 2 children in the time it took for the United States to approve his visa. And that's for someone who has served the country, like you said, not just someone who was trying to start a better life for themselves.
Absolutely. And not to create more confusion, but I will explain one adjacent program. The United States has what's called the Afghan Special Immigrant Visa Program, or the SIV program. And the Afghan SIVs are individuals who've specifically assisted the U.S. mission in Afghanistan. The SIV program is one that operates apart from the refugee resettlement program because they are processed through consular affairs, the State Department, and with the U.S. Embassy overseas. They go through very similar and arguably even more security checks by virtue of assisting the U.S. mission overseas. However, Afghan SIVs are permitted to be processed to the United States, even if the refugee resettlement program itself has ground to a halt.
What are some of the key ways in which the Trump administration has changed the staffing or the mechanism or the budgeting of refugee programs to make it less functional, as you're describing?
One thing we know is that for countries that are subject to enhanced security vetting called security advisory opinions or SAO checks, the administration has reduced the number of staff who are in charge of handling and moving those cases. We also know that within the Department of Homeland Security, USCIS, which is in charge of conducting in-person interviews overseas directly with refugees, USCIS has reduced the number of Refugee Corps officers who conduct those what we refer to as circuit rides overseas to do those interviews. They've pulled staff off. They've reduced the number of circuit rides. They've reduced the duration of circuit rides. And as of right now, there are no plans for USCIS to conduct circuit rides for the first 2 quarters of fiscal 2021, which is particularly disheartening.
Now, as I mentioned in my introduction, former Vice President Joe Biden has said that if he wins the election next month, he will raise the cap on refugees to 125,000. That is something he can do with a stroke of a pen on day one?
Yes, we commend the Biden campaign for pushing for a rebuild of the refugee resettlement program above and beyond historic norms. The next administration can come in and on day one immediately notify Congress of its plan to increase the refugee admissions goal for fiscal 2021, and then consult with Congress to discuss its plan for how it will rebuild the resettlement program and reach that admissions goal, and then officially sign a new refugee admissions goal for the remaining of FY 2021.
What about some of these other elements related to staffing of programs like what you were just discussing? How easy will it be for the next administration to rebuild those?
Well, it's definitely going to require the administration and Congress to work together. The Trump administration has taken a hammer to the Statue of Liberty when it comes to the resettlement program and welcoming the most vulnerable. So it is incredibly important that we are doubling down on rebuilding both the overseas infrastructure as well as the domestic infrastructure to assist refugees who are arriving in the United States. And that's going to mean the administration conducting an audit of the changes that have taken place, how we can make the program more efficient, how many additional staff are going to be needed, and we're going to need Congress to appropriate additional federal funding, both for the State Department as well as for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, to make sure that that infrastructure overseas and in the U.S. is being rebuilt as we commit to increasing the number of refugee arrivals during the course of the next administration.
To what extent will there be diplomatic legwork involved as well, given that the Trump administration has signed some agreements with foreign countries regarding its own asylum obligations?
Yeah, that's a really important question. But the resettlement program, as I said, does further our diplomacy goals and foreign policy goals. By virtue of the U.S. committing to resettle more refugees, it encourages other countries to do the same. And a few years ago, there were more than 30 countries that resettled refugees. And today, it's been about half of that have actually resettled refugees through 2019 and 2020. And so we know that U.S. leadership is incredibly important to being able to resettle the most vulnerable refugees. But we also know that the resettlement program in the United States has helped with integration efforts for refugees who are unable to be resettled. So, for example, back in 2016, when the U.S. committed to increasing the number of Syrian refugees we were going to resettle, it helped encourage the Jordanian government to help refugees' kids go to school and allow refugee adults access the dignity of work. And so across the globe, the United States is going to have to undertake a massive effort to rebuild those relationships and rebuild the trust that the United States is actually going to live out the best of its values.
Some of the common arguments we hear against admitting more refugees have to do with the perceived difficulty that refugees might have integrating into U.S. society, or in some cases, they're even seen as a security risk, or even taking jobs away from native-born Americans. How would you respond to some of those arguments?
I would say that refugees are an economic boost to the United States and contribute significantly to our country, to our economy, to our communities, to our congregations. Even during the pandemic, there were 176,000 refugee healthcare workers and 175,000 refugee workers supporting our food supply, such as from farms to manufacturers to food service to restaurants. But over the last several decades, we've been conducting studies at the state and local levels to learn more about refugee integration. And nationwide, research has shown that refugees revitalize cities and towns by offsetting population decline. They have a high rate of entrepreneurship and starting businesses, paying taxes, buying homes. And by virtue of starting these businesses, they're able to create a lot of jobs for the community. And I'll say that, for example, in Columbus, Ohio, the rate of entrepreneurship among refugees is double that of the general population and support more than 21,000 jobs and contribute $1.6 billion to their local economy every year.
And yet we hear this strident anti-immigrant, anti-refugee rhetoric coming from the Trump administration, including from the president himself at a rally as the notice was being transmitted to Congress of this new low cap on refugee admissions. Trump was in the state of Minnesota railing against Representative Ilhan Omar, who comes from Minnesota and is a Somali refugee, now U.S. citizen. What kind of damage do you see this rhetoric doing to the U.S. political discourse around this issue of refugees and asylum seekers in the United States?
It's certainly really harmful. The refugee clients that we've worked with are seeing rhetoric that is not just polarizing, but is sending a message of exclusion and unwelcome when we have committed as a country that we're going to help resettle refugees who have been forced from their homes. So that in and of itself is particularly disheartening. But even beyond that, it is deeply unfair to be using refugees or any immigrant or new American as some kind of political football to gain political points. The refugee resettlement program has historically been a bipartisan one. Administrations of both parties have supported the resettlement program. And even as recently as last month, we've seen a letter signed by more than 500 state and local elected officials across all 50 states, plus DC, demonstrate their support for refugees and urge the administration to sign a robust refugee admissions goal. And these elected officials represent both parties as well and is bipartisan in nature. So it is not just unfair, but really harmful to the community. We've also seen, as Southern Poverty Law Center has researched, a spike in the number of hate crimes in this country against our Muslim neighbors, against our refugee and immigrant neighbors, against our Black and Brown neighbors. And so the hateful rhetoric can turn into action when we should be sending a message of love and welcome.
Have we seen any notable shifts in public opinion in terms of how many people support more refugees coming to the United States under the Trump era?
Sure. I mean, today we have seen how communities have been asking to resettle more refugees and to help more refugee families. We have countless congregations across the country that are asking, where are the refugees? We have businesses like in the meatpacking industry that have asked, where are the refugee workers that should be coming in? And so that part is what makes my soul happy, is to see how communities from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, to Buffalo, New York, to Omaha, Nebraska, are all asking to help refugee families arrive, help them get set up with their new apartments and their new houses, help refugee kids integrate in school. But we simply have seen how this administration continues to grind the resettlement program to a halt. And even today, the resettlement program is currently ground to a halt because this administration has not set the refugee admissions goal and signed the refugee admissions goal for FY 2021, meaning the resettlement program is not welcoming refugees to the United States right now.
Given the nativist turn that the Republican Party has taken under Trump, do you foresee a political lift or a political backlash if Biden wins the election and tries to rebuild the refugee program?
That is a good question. The Trump administration issued an executive order last fall that allows states and localities to veto and block refugee resettlement in their communities. Church World Service is one of the plaintiffs in that case. And court intervention has, to date, blocked the implementation of that executive order. However, by the time there was a court injunction preventing that executive order from being implemented, 43 governors had announced their support for continuing to resettle refugees. One state, Governor Abbott of Texas, was the only governor to come out and formally decline to consent to continuing resettlement in the state. And so to the extent there is a backlash against refugees if there's a new administration in place in January, I will be looking to state legislatures to see where that backlash would pop up, and making sure I'm paying attention to that. However, at the same time, countless localities across the country had consented to continuing resettlement. And so even if there is a backlash in certain states, we know that it will be met with an even more powerful support and welcome for refugees.
43 governors saying they would continue to resettle refugees. I would imagine there was a substantial number of Republicans among them too, no?
Absolutely. Almost half were Republican governors who came out and consented to resettlement, which just goes to show the historic bipartisan nature of the resettlement program since it was codified into law through the Refugee Act of 1980.
In other words, the loudest anti-immigrant, anti-refugee nativist voices may not be speaking for the mainstream.
Exactly. In during the Reagan years, for example, 1982, we set an admissions goal of 140,000 refugees. And the average refugee admissions goal from 1980 until this administration was 95,000. And we have actually resettled up to about 207,000 refugees in a given fiscal year. So the resettlement program has support. Local communities around the country welcome refugees, and we definitely have the capacity to do so. And even as we face a global pandemic, we should make sure that we aren't retreating in welcoming the most vulnerable when we know that refugees are working on the front lines of the pandemic response and helping keep food on our shelves. And like all international travelers, refugees are undergoing thorough medical checks for COVID-like symptoms before entering the U.S. And quarantine for 14 days upon arrival.
Is there anything else important that you'd like to mention before we wrap up?
I think it's important that we continue to keep up the pressure on Congress to hold the administration accountable to fulfill its responsibilities, even while they deal with other really important issues that they're dealing with today. Congress and the administration have a responsibility to American communities and to refugees around the world to make sure that we're not abdicating our leadership in the resettlement program. And so I think people need to know that they can and should be calling their members of Congress and asking them to pressure the administration to immediately conduct meaningful consultations about the resettlement program, increase the refugee admissions goal to 95,000, the historic average, and sign the refugee admissions goal officially for FY 2021 immediately following those consultations.
Meredith, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Meredith Owen is the Interim Director of Policy and Advocacy in the Immigration and Refugee Program at Church World Service, which is one of the 9 refugee resettlement agencies in the United States. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. While you're at it, don't forget to subscribe to Trendlines wherever you get your podcasts. This episode was produced by me, Elliot Waldman, and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow us on Twitter. My handle is @ElliotWaldman. That's 2 L's, 1 T. Peter is @PeterDoerrie. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.